told us that the president's voting for.
I emailed this to Bazinet, who asked at the conclusion of last Friday's briefing, and because I was the one that asked those questions for the record. Well, I'm sorry. He emailed me because I guess it had drawn the interest.
So the question.
Well, I didn't know the answer. It drew some apparent attention in New York. I asked the president. He said he hoped for a good series, but didn't have a strong pull for either team.
Does that mean 7 games?
There goes Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Do not put up with
We'll
that kind of
see.
answer.
What's
Does
that?
that mean 7 games, a good series?
I think he would probably hope to see 7. I know Jake would hope to be around for 7, but I think
So at least we know who's
there's,
rooting
I
for in
say
Game 6.
there's no doubt that he was rooting for Pluff last year, but apparently thinks Pluff is just fine this year. So, Mr. Feller?
Thanks, Robert. A few questions on Afghanistan.
The president announced earlier this year that he was sending more troops. This was back in March. He said that the Afghanistan government was undermined by corruption, and he said we will seek a new compact with the Afghan government that cracks down on corrupt behavior and sets clear benchmarks. So to start, I'm wondering, has this government delivered on any of that yet? Are you all measuring whether the Karzai government is trying to stop corruption and whether that's working?
Well, I think what the president was alluding to in March is precisely the conversations that are being had by the embassy, by the ambassador, by the State Department, and by others here with the newly elected Karzai government.
So that's a process that's still starting?
Well, these are conversations, as I mentioned yesterday, that were had before and during the election process that took quite some time. But the president and his team are actively engaged in seeking that new compact.
He said just yesterday that he reiterated that he wants a more serious effort to eradicate corruption, better governance, and so forth. I'm wondering, are those, he talked about he wants deeds, not just words, so I'm wondering, when he lays out those points that he's looking for, what is he, are they just wishes, or is there going to be any connection between wanting to see results and his decision to send more troops?
Well, understand the end of the quote that you read, set clear benchmarks for international assistance that are used to provide for the needs of the Afghan people. Obviously, as the president reiterates, this is not just rhetoric. There have to be deliverables to this, and I don't want to get ahead of where the process is at this point in commenting on some of those specifics. I'd also mention what the president said yesterday. That includes an infrastructure for training Afghan national security forces. Both the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police ultimately are going to have to take charge of the security situation in the country. I've said this, the president has said this, that we're not going to be there forever. What is accomplished on the security side will eventually have to be transferred to those two entities that comprise the Afghan National Security Forces, and that's certainly part of improved governance.
Just to sum up here, I guess I'm just trying to figure out the connection between those important points that this government is looking for from Afghanistan and the president's upcoming decision. Is there a direct connection?
Well, look, as I said yesterday, Ben, there isn't anybody involved in these discussions, whether you're on the civilian side from the State Department, whether you're on the civilian side of the National Security Council, I have no idea what that noise was, or whether or not, or whether you're in the military at the Pentagon, that without improvement and without a sustained effort by the government of Afghanistan, our efforts there are not and won't be successful. So obviously, ensuring improved governance is part of that equation. Yes.
On the corruption issue in particular, are there any deadlines or actual measuring sticks that are being contemplated now to impose upon Karzai?
Well, again,
sure
as I said,
achieves
Ben,
those
I
aims?
don't want to get ahead of the process that's ongoing with the embassy right now.
It has been years in which Karzai has been under this kind of pressure, and are we to see something new here that hasn't been tried before?
I think the president was clear yesterday that it was time for a new chapter. Absolutely. I think I don't want to delve too far back into the history of this, but I don't think there's anybody that would tell you that we can continue doing what has been done in years past and hope to see different results.
Well, European Commission President Barroso is here, and he'll be meeting with the President later. He already said today that the European countries have no interest in sending more troops to Afghanistan. Now, does that in any way affect or figure into the President's review process on possible U.S.
There's a security conference, I think scheduled, I have the calendar in front of me, I think for the 23rd of November, involving NATO countries, and I'll wait for them to meet and have more definitive news on this. Yes, sir.
Working on good governance and anti-corruption those are general goals. What are some specific things that you guys would be looking for?
Again, I'm not going to get into discussing publicly the compact that the embassy is working through with the Afghan government.
The CIT bankruptcy, do you guys have any response to that? It's $2.3 billion of taxpayer money that I guess is just going to vanish into thin air?
Obviously, CIT received, as you mentioned, several $1 billion of assistance in December of 2008. They have come back a couple of times looking for additional assistance. They've had a year to restructure, which they are now, a process that is now ongoing. We are heartened by the fact that they will continue to lend to important small business customers, and we will continue to seek ways to stabilize the financial system.
Are the taxpayers just out that money?
Well, there's obviously a process that's now that will now be ongoing in terms of their planned bankruptcy, and obviously we have a stake in how that comes out as the taxpayers have invested that money.
Thanks, Robert. I wanted to talk about H1N1 virus. A year ago in the campaign, one of the themes from the president was about Republicans had not governed very effectively, cited Katrina, war in Iraq, incompetence in government. But when it comes to H1N1, you've made some big promises about tens of millions of vaccines that would be available to the American people. They're obviously not available. And so far the message has been that the manufacturing companies had really rosy scenarios. But don't people here in the Obama administration bear some responsibility for not asking the right questions, getting the right answers from these manufacturers before you told the American people you could deliver 120 million vaccines?
Well, look, if we fell fault to the scenarios that the manufacturers said that they could manufacture a vaccine in, of course. And I'll take you back to last spring at the beginning of this process, in which H1N1 is a virus that we see popping up around the world, around the globe. The president took very strong action in setting up a team to deal with this. I'm reminded of, I think there was some snickering about the president talking about how to cough and how to sneeze, and that you should wash your hands, all of which, for anybody that knows somebody with that, is not a laughing matter now. I think the president and his team have taken extraordinary action to deal with this situation. And as I said last week, Ed, I don't know if you asked this or somebody else did, obviously the president is frustrated that there's anybody that is in one of these groups, at a high-risk group, that is having trouble getting the vaccine now, and we're making progress on getting more and more of that vaccine each day.
So what's your promise to the American people now? Because they are wondering, they're waiting on long lines, sometimes they wait 2 hours and then they get to the front of the line, there's no more vaccine. What's your message to them now? What's the promise now about
The
how
promise
you're
is
going
that
to
we're
fix it?
working each and every day to fix this. I don't know what the updated numbers are. I know there's a daily briefing now with that I'm sure many of your technical questions will be addressed. I don't know the available number of doses now, but when we went through this last week, there were 3 million additional doses over a 2-day period of time. And again, the president is working every day to ensure that people that want and need this vaccine have it.
And last thing, while you're still trying to ensure that, and there are a lot of Americans who haven't been able to get it, why did the Obama administration decide to make the vaccine available to prisoners at Guantanamo Bay?
There is no vaccine in Guantanamo, and there's no vaccine on the way to Guantanamo.
So the Pentagon was wrong when they confirmed that on Friday?
I don't know what the Pentagon said, I know in asking yesterday whether or not there was any vaccine there or whether there was any vaccine that was on its way, the answer to both those questions was.
White House stopped it, or?
No, that was because there wasn't any there and there wasn't any on the way.
Getting back to the topic of money possibly vanishing into thin air, it's not just CIT. GAO reported yesterday that taxpayers will probably never recoup all or even close to all of the tens of billions of dollars that have been poured into General Motors and Chrysler. Should the American people assume that that money is just gone?
No, I don't think so, and I don't think that's what the GAO reported. The president made some tough and extraordinary decisions to seek some financial assistance for GM and Chrysler. Again, not easy decisions, but the president also believed that we had a chance to remake a more competitive American auto industry that employs tens of thousands of Americans.
But GA found that they would have to have a market GAO, excuse me, would have to have a market capitalization of $67 billion. They've never exceeded $57 billion.
Well,
isn't it just wishful thinking to think that they would ever get to that level again?
Well, I think what we need to do is get our economy moving again so that we have car sales that begin to see an uptick. I think you saw reports yesterday of the first time that Ford Motor Company had turned a profit in its North American operations since 2005.
Ford and GM are very different creatures. I mean, you're talking about, I mean, everybody has been talking about a sized-down GM. How are they going to exceed their market capitalization?
The basis for any market capitalization is what? Auto sales, right? So obviously we have seen as the economy has slowed, a decline from traditional auto sales figures that you saw in 2006 or even 2007 and parts of 2008. The president's working each and every day to get the economy moving again, to create conditions where people have the type of income they need to purchase new cars. We've instituted new fuel mileage standards so that the new cars that people buy go farther on a tank of gas and spit out less pollutants as they do so. And I think we see that GM and Chrysler have begun to make strides in putting themselves on firmer footing.
So of that $67 billion, or depending on how you count it, $67 billion that went into those two companies, what can the
that or
American
that
people,
market capitalization?
That's the money that went to them.
Yeah.
How much of that can the American people expect to get back?
I haven't read the full report.
No, but are you saying that
I
the
don't have
American
that. I don't
people
have
will get
any
a
of that.
substantial amount of it back? Or
I think the American people will see some of that money returned, yes.
a lot of it? A little of it?
I'm not the cars are. Yep.
Hi. Is the president's decision on Afghanistan still weeks, plural, away?
Yes.
Weeks.
It was weeks yesterday and it's weeks today.
Okay. What additional information is the president waiting for to make this decision? Are there outstanding issues?
Well, the president continues to meet with advisors. He met last Friday with the Joint Chiefs, and they'll be back again for an additional meeting either late this week or early next week.
Does the president feel a sense of urgency at all? I mean, one
He
imagines
has
you
said
could.
that since the beginning, yes.
Yeah, it just seems that there's a lot of meetings. We now have an election. I just wonder if you could let us in on the process here, particularly in the context, let's face it, of some accusations of delaying or dithering. I'm just wondering if you could let us into the process.
I addressed those so-called allegations before.
I guess, but do you understand what I'm getting at?
Vaguely.
What is the president trying? Okay. What is the president hoping to learn? What is he? What more information is he hoping to
Let me explain this the way I
obtain?
explained this yesterday, Savannah. The president, as you saw administration officials explaining over the weekend, the president and his team have a goal that remains unchanged: to dismantle, disrupt, and ultimately destroy Al-Qaeda. That is what the team is working on putting together is a military and a civilian strategy that best accomplishes that goal. That's what the team has been evaluating in Afghanistan, how that relates to our relationship with Pakistan and the region as a whole in crafting a policy that addresses all of these things.
Last thing, will the president seek to meet with General McChrystal in person here at the White House
I
before
think we've
making
said
his
in the past
decision?
that would likely be the case, yes.
Just follow up, why would the decision not come sooner now that the election's been settled? Wasn't that
The-
one of the reasons it was
The
taking so
election
long?
certainly was part of the equation, but not the whole equation.
It should be sooner, now that the
Why?
election's settled. Well, if it's part of the equation, then that's one factor that now has been settled, so you'd think he could move more
Well,
quickly.
then go with a couple of days, but I still think it's a couple of weeks. Yes, sir.
Two quick questions. First on the election.
Which one? You gotta be a little bit more specific.
The elections of today.
Okay.
A year ago, the president was appealing to independent voters, Republican voters, as a post-partisan politician. And you know, in recent appearances, especially on Sunday, he seemed to be trying to rally the Democratic base. I wonder if the lesson for midterm elections next year and for today's elections is that post-partisanship is over, and now it's a question of just getting out the base.
That generally happens 2 days before an election, right? You tend to want to get your voters. I hope this isn't a new concept. You tend to want to get your voters to the poll on election day. I think that's generally the case. This president believes that the candidates that he's made appearances for are, he believes will be, are the best candidates for the jobs with which they're running. In talking about appealing to both independent voters, I'd let the president's approval rating with independent voters speak for itself. And I think if you look at the efforts that the president's made and the perception of the efforts, the perception that people have about those efforts, that they see a president that's trying to work with the Republican Party on the issues that are important to the American people. We tried that in the recovery plan. We've tried that with health care, only to have, I think in the last 24 hours, Republicans finally decide to come up with their alternative ideas for health care reform. Health care reform ideas, I might mention that by all reports don't include banning insurance companies from discriminating against sick people. But the president's going to continue to try to work with Republicans that seek to and want to work with him and want to work for reform and to address the issues that are important in people's lives.
On health care, does the president feel that the House bill is sufficiently neutral on the abortion question, or would he support some conservative Democrats who want
I'm
language
not
change?
going to interject from here into a process of discussion on the House side of how to address that.
And although you've said it before, you haven't said it today on the referendum issue.
I'm happy to do it
If
again.
Cree Deeds or John Corzine or Bill Owens were to win today, the president doesn't want any credit, and if they lose, he doesn't want any blame?
No, I don't. I'm unclear if I've had an opportunity to intone
Please
either of
speak it
those. I simply said, and I find I'm always amused by the fact that the motives for which I say these things are always imparted. This is just what I believe. I don't think the two gubernatorial races, I don't think looking at the two gubernatorial races you can draw with any great insight what's going to happen a year from now, any more than if Jake's team wins tomorrow night, I can tell who's going to win next year's World Series.
Not really what I was asking. If the three candidates that the president has campaigned for and wants to win and are seen as the three key races this year, if they win, will the White House view it as support for the president's views? Or
Again, we don't look at either of these gubernatorial races or the congressional race as something that portends a lot for our legislative efforts going forward or political prospects in 2010.
Warren Buffett's described his acquisition.
you still didn't hit it on the nail. You know that.
I
Deliberate, or is it?
No, see, I love maybe we're just passing in the night, Mark. I don't know whether that's I don't know whether that's maybe with less sound, but it's yeah. Go ahead.
So Warren Buffett described his acquisition of Burlington Northern. He represents an all-in wager in the economic future of the United States. Does the White House take this as an endorsement of the president's economic policies?
I am not going to comment on the investment decisions of certain investors. I don't think that would behoove.
You've moved markets before.
I'm seeking desperately for a little stability today. I think that Warren Buffett is somebody who, obviously, as you know, the president has sought advice and counsel from. But I'm not going to get into his individual investment decisions.
It's more his words. I mean, he's talking about, it's an all-in wager in the economic future of the United States. I mean, if, we're back to baseball metaphors. This is a big fat one right up the middle.
Well, I will simply say this. I think that the president values his advice, as he does many others, and the president is doing what he believes is right and best to get our economy back on track and moving again. I think you saw that in the statistics that were released just at the end of last week, and hope that people continue to have confidence in the decisions that the president makes.
On tomorrow, the education speech in Madison, what can we expect on that?
I think you all got to, I'll leave some of this aside for you all to talk to Melody about in a little bit. Obviously, the president has, through both the recovery plan and through initiatives at the Department of Education, sought to reform our schools so that they can better compete in the 21st century and create a more skilled workforce to assume the jobs that we're creating for the future. I think the president will take some time to talk about those efforts tomorrow, and I would encourage you all to get on the phone and ask Melody specifically about that. Major.
Robert, let me follow up on Mark, if I could. Sunday, when the president appeared with Governor Corzine said, "I'm going to be a partner." The president said John Corzine's been a reliable partner. Corzine's making it very clear that he wants to work with the president, has talked about job creations and jobs saved in New Jersey because of the stimulus. Why then shouldn't what happens today reflect in some way, shape, or form on New Jersey voters' attitudes about their governor partnering with his president?
Well, look.
Because in Virginia, that has not been the message of the Democratic candidate, to some consternation here at the White House. Brady did not say, "I'm an Obama Democrat," and the White House did not take kindly to that strategic approach to his campaign. So when you have two different campaigns like that, why shouldn't what happened in New Jersey at least reflect some way, shape, or form what voters are thinking about Corzine and the president now? Not 2010, but now.
I'll let people look into their crystal balls and figure out what all this stuff means for the future. The president believes that the best candidate to lead New Jersey today and tomorrow is John Corzine. That's what the endorsement is about. Governor Corzine was somebody who the president knew and worked with in the Senate, and somebody he believes is best suited to lead New Jersey for the next 4 years. I think that's what the endorsement means, and I think that's the support that the president was trying to convey.
And if Corzine wins, then his and if Corzine wins, then his endorsement means what? His endorsement means that there are tangible benefits to running alongside the president. Correct?
I'm gonna wait to navel gaze when we have some navel gazing to look at.
Okay. Why did the White House?
Ask Tommy on Wednesday, right?
He's in Copenhagen.
Why did the White House find it worth its while to encourage Dede Scozzafava to endorse Bill Owens?
Well, I think that what the candidate, the former Republican nominee, decided was, and talked to, I'm sure, both Republicans and Democrats both in New York and nationally, about who she thought was best suited to carry on the things that she cared about and believed in, and she decided that that candidate was the Democrat.
But Pat Gaspard from the White House called her and talked to her and
And
helped
Chuck
arrange
Schumer,
Sheldon Silver
I'm
and
sure
Chuck
Michael
Schumer
Steele
and Andrew
and-
Cuomo and others. Much of that
And
encouraged
I'm
by the
sure
White
Newt
House.
Gingrich, and sure, I mean,
I'm just curious why the White House felt it was worth your while to get so deeply involved in that race if none of this really matters as far as 2010 or anything else.
I think there are interesting, I do think there are interesting tidbits that we see coming out of New York 23. You see the Republican Party having picked a candidate, elements of the Republican Party deciding they don't like that candidate, and basically doing what they needed to do to get that candidate off the ballot. I think there are a host of primaries that that will affect 2010 next year that pit moderate Republican candidates and conservative Republican candidates. I think a lot of people decided that in a district that had sent Republicans to Congress, parts of that district since the 1800s traditionally had sent moderate Republicans. I think many in the Republican Party hung out a sign, as you heard people at the White House say this weekend, that moderates need not apply. I do think that has ramifications for next year because you've got primaries that you all are and will cover that pit very similar elements of that argument against each other next year.
A couple quick ones on Afghanistan. Karzai said today he wants to, quote, make sure that the taxpayers' money coming to us from your countries, the United States and others, but let's just talk about the U.S., is spent wisely and rightly by us. Does the White House believe that standard is currently being met?
We have made, obviously, important investments in the troops that we have put in Afghanistan, as well as through international assistance. I think I would simply, without getting into, as I said earlier, not to go back too far in history, I think the President understands that for any of our efforts to be successful, it's time for a new chapter in Afghan history.
You can't say whether it's being, that standard that he said is being met yet.
The President is anxious to see improvement.
Would the President need to visit Afghanistan before making his final decision on troops or strategy?
No.
He would not. Okay, that's not necessary.
The President was in Afghanistan, I guess sometime last July. I'd have to, or June, I can't remember when the trip was. I don't think it's necessary for the President to do so.
Okay. Does he need any more information from the Joint Chiefs that was reporting Friday that he asked them for some specific data back?
As I said to Savannah, I think there'll be, as we said Friday, there'll be another meeting to go through additional recommendations that the Pentagon is working through.
Will that meeting occur before he leaves for Asia?
Either early this week, either late this week or early next week, but I assume before Asia, yes.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Robert. In meeting with Chancellor Merkel this morning and the European Commission officials this afternoon, will President Obama be making specific requests for additional help in Afghanistan?
Let me get a readout from the private meeting that the President, if there is a readout of the private meeting that the President had with Chancellor Merkel.
Quick follow. Yesterday you said...
I will say this. I think you all heard the President say, and I would be remiss if I didn't repeat what the President said about the tremendous and important contributions that Germany in particular has made to NATO efforts in Afghanistan.
Yesterday you said that once he makes his decision, he'll be walking the American people through it. Are you planning an Oval Office address?
I said this last week, I think a question that Jeff asked, and we have not spent a ton of time on the actual on actually what that would look like, except I know the President has told us, not necessarily as it relates to some venue or some speech, but that it is important for the American people to understand why he made the decision that he's made. And I anticipate that the President will spend some time walking the American people through the process that we've undertaken and the decision points that he's made along the way to come to the ultimate conclusion that he's come to.
One more very quick thing, and again, on timing, and I know we're slicing this pretty thin, but if he may not meet with the Joint Chiefs until early next week, it sounds like a decision will wait until after Asia.
The only guidance that I have is to reiterate coming weeks. I don't have anything more clear than that. I'm sorry.
Robert, climate change is also a big issue for the European Union. To what extent is the president using his personal powers of persuasion to talk to folks on the Hill, members of the Senate, on climate change in the fashion that he has been doing on health care?
Well, I mean, I think he's obviously had an opportunity to meet with members of the Senate over the past few weeks. I assume those conversations have included discussions on energy, and I think those conversations will continue as we seek to continue the progress that the House made in passing comprehensive energy and climate change legislation.
Have there been any specific energy or climate change related
Let me get from Ben LeBolt and others what Carol Browner, what the EPA and the Department of Energy have done on this, and see the degree to which the president's also had individual conversations.
Also on the elections today, you talked about interesting tidbits coming out of New York. To what extent is the president looking at the elections today in New York, Virginia, and New Jersey as a reflection of what Americans think about the job he is doing, and sort of to what extent is he looking at them to forecast ahead to what he and Democrats need to do in 2010?
Well, I doubt the president disagrees with me in saying that I don't think these, as I have said, Mark, each of the last 3 times we've met, I don't think the president is looking at these and believes that they say anything about our future legislative efforts or our future political efforts. Again, in 2001, President Bush lost Virginia and New Jersey. I don't believe that it impacted his legislative initiatives going forward. And as I recall, happily sitting at one of the campaign committees in 2002, that the elections didn't seem unambiguous as to their results. In 2005,
in any way on his performance?
I would quote for you the pollster that from the Washington Post who asked specifically this question in the Virginia electorate. 70% said that their vote had nothing to do with the president. Those that, the other 30% that said their vote either had, was intended to either show support for or opposition to the president. That number was evenly split. And if anything, the illuminating number coming out of that is registered voters approved of the president's job in among Virginians by a number of 57%, which exceeds by 5 the amount the president received in Virginia a year ago.
But, well, Cheryl, your answer gets partway there. These political questions aren't about, no.
I like that. I'm getting graded. Mark, I got an incomplete for you, but as I work my way this way, I'm getting better, apparently.
We'll see.
These questions, Robert, these questions aren't about the next year and the future and what it portends. It's about what the president has done for the last year since he won re-election. Are you saying that if Democrats win in any of these locations, you won't stand there tomorrow and say, yes, the president gets some credit for that?
What I'm saying, again, as I've said Monday and I said Friday, I know there's a great cottage industry in this lovely town that looks at what happens today and sees what it portends for next year. Hold on. Let me. I know you'll find it incomplete, but it's my answer. You know, we can do this. We can look at this and what it means, and I happen to honestly believe. I know that's gasp, get your notebook out, Gibbs honest. I don't believe that local elections in Virginia and New Jersey portend a lot about legislative success or political success in the future. I just don't.
Forget the future. What does it mean for what the people think of what the president has done for the last year?
Well,
is it a grade for the president the last year?
Again, the question was asked specifically amongst a representative sample of those that will participate in the elections taking place today to elect the next governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, right? That question very specifically resulted in 70% of the Virginia population. I know I hate to let facts get in the way of good navel gazing, but that's just what the poll said.
Robert,
again, don't quote me, quote the Washington Post.
I don't want to hold good.
That's an entirely different subject, apparently.
Robert, considering the United States' long engagement in Berlin and President Kennedy's statement when he went there, why did this president decide he could not accept the invitation to go for the 20th anniversary commemoration like all the other leaders who helped control Berlin during the interim?
Well, the president obviously is talked a little bit about in his remarks with Chancellor Merkel today, talked about the monumentous events of almost 30 years ago. I'm sorry, almost 20 years ago with the fall of the wall. Obviously, we have a lot to work on here, and we have commitments for an upcoming Asia trip, but soon a very senior delegation of American officials will be announced to go to that ceremony in Germany.
Can I do a quick follow-up on that?
Sure.
Are you
Which
asserting
one?
The one about the election.
Yeah.
Are you asserting that the voters who go to the polls today, who are feeling economic anxiety, who feel the country's on the wrong track, the Democrats who are not as enthusiastic today as they were a year ago, none of that has any bearing on the president's performance at all?
No, I don't. I'm not sure exactly what some of that is, what you're premising your question on is based off of. I'm not suggesting there's not economic anxiety. I'm not suggesting that there's not frustration with Washington's inability to deal with fundamental problems in our society. That's exactly what the president's working on each and every day, to make healthcare more affordable, to create good-paying jobs, to create a new foundation for economic recovery through jobs in the 21st century. I'm not saying there's not economic anxiety in this country, but again, if you look at I'm just reading what was written about the poll by the people conducting the poll who talked to the voters about what they're saying and what they're feeling.
What about voter enthusiasm and the fact that it seems, at least anecdotally, we'll know it more at the end?
Let's discuss when we have something to base it more on than anecdote. Yep.
Robert, the president said in Massachusetts that Congress looks at local elections and they read tea leaves. That being the case, if the Democrats go over 3 today, why wouldn't Congress look at that and think this maybe there's not that support?
Let's deal with hypotheticals tomorrow when we can decide whether somebody went 0 for 3 or 1 for 3 or whether a walk counted as not counting as an at bat. And what's that?
Let me just get the question out.
Okay.
If the president goes,
do you want me to wait for you to tell you that I'm going to deal with hyhypotheticals tomorrow?
Let me just try the question.
Sure.
Yeah. And then you can tell me you're not going to answer.
Okay.
If he goes 3 for 3 and they do really well, why isn't that, in a sense, a validation of the president's policies? And why wouldn't Capitol Hill look at that and decide this is a strong president, politically in a good position, we want to get behind his agenda?
Should I do it now? Okay. Let's wait and deal with hypotheticals tomorrow. Yep.
Incomplete.
Incomplete. It's the best I can do.
Let's switch to the economy, and you might have touched on this yesterday. When the Volcker board comes up with their recommendations, and when you make decisions on those recommendations, is that...
Oh, you're talking about the PRAB? Okay, yeah, okay.
Is that, first of all, is that going to be before the budget, or, I mean, is that going to be this year that you come up with this, not stimulus 2, but whatever you want to call it?
I believe that one of the reasons, obviously, that the president wanted to have this quarterly meeting of his Economic Recovery Advisory Board focus on jobs was, as we've seen the beginnings of economic growth, we have to make sure that we're looking at evaluating all ideas for creating an environment, a better environment for creating jobs. I think the suggestions that he got from individuals yesterday will be analyzed and looked at this year by our economic advisors here.
This year as part of coming up with individual proposals this year, or could they be just part of the budget?
They could be either. They could be, again, as I've said, the president is constantly evaluating ideas for job creation and as well as for implementing in the budget.
One more. Is he less inclined to make those recommendations add to the deficit? We had the budget director today in New York talking about the importance of the deficit. Is it possible that the decisions that he makes on the next economic steps will be deficit neutral?
Well, look, I think that part of that is an evaluation that the economic team will have to make. I think one of the messages that Peter had in New York was one way to, the most important way in dealing with our federal deficit right now is to get our economy moving again. That's what the economic team is focused on, and that will have the most impact in the short term on that budget deficit. April?
Robert, two questions, one on the economy, then on the elections. First, on the economy, a report saying nearly half of all U.S. children will be on food stamps, 90% of black children at some point during their childhood. What say you about that?
Well, I have not looked through the entire report. I saw some news reports of what you just mentioned. A couple of things. Obviously, the president has, in the recovery plan, worked to ensure that those that are struggling with our economy have the appropriate safety net that they need when they've hit on hard times. And an answer not dissimilar to what I just gave on the budget deficit, and that is the best way to address that problem is to get our economy moving and growing more consistently in a robust fashion. We are more than a year removed from the events of last September and are almost 2 years into, or 2 years away from, I should say, the official delineation of an economic recession that caused a huge economic slowdown and then obviously has resulted on more and more people hitting on hard times and their inability to find work.
Now on the election issue, and it's centered around today via Michael Steele. Michael Steele says these elections are competitive, but if indeed there are Democratic losses today, you can blame it on the fact that this president is overexposed, primarily on issues to include the health care debate. Now, this is today. This is not next year. This is not yesterday. This is today.
It was convoluted reasoning yesterday, and it's convoluted reasoning today and tomorrow. Bill?
Well, wait a minute. But if the president, I'm sorry, Bill.
No, go ahead.
But if the president does lose these gubernatorial seats, what does that say to this administration on a year away from when?
You've asked Ann's question, and I would refer you to Ann's.
Another way I'm trying to get an answer.
Right, I'd refer you to Ann's answer.
Okay.
Yes.
On healthcare, there's a public plan option as part of the House bill, a public plan option, a very different one as part of the Senate bill. Debate starts very soon in both houses. Which version of the public plan option does the president prefer? Which one?
I have not talked specifically to the team about that. The president, as I've said in the past, will evaluate what comes to his desk for choice and competition.
But before that, isn't it time for the president, or important for the president at some point to say, I prefer this one over that one?
Yeah. The president is very pleased with the progress that we're making and the approach that he's taken to get us to a point where...
Either one?
Now you're back to my first
elections
answer.
tomorrow.
Now you're back to my first answer, which I said when that bill gets to our desk, we'd be happy to evaluate it. Sam?
It's reported that the president's meeting with Senator Blanche Lincoln tonight, and I was wondering if there's similarly scheduled meetings with Senator Joseph Lieberman, or if the president has reached out to Senator Lieberman since he's expressed his concerns about the bill.
I know of either no meetings, neither meetings nor phone calls with the president and Senator Lieberman.
Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, guys.